Hello and welcome to episode 237 of Something About the Beatles. A couple things I want to get out of the way from the outset here before I set up the show. Actually, three things. First, I was wondering if anybody listening to the show, a regular listener of the show, better still, was at the Paul show at Glastonbury. That would be really cool to talk to somebody who was there, because I think most of us by now have seen the BBC broadcast of it if we weren't there ourselves. But if you were there, that would be an amazing thing, because I think a video can only convey so much, but by every written account and review and just online buzz I've seen, it was something truly, truly amazing. And it'd be really cool to get a first-hand account from somebody who was there of what it was like. So if anybody was there that's hearing this show or knows somebody that was there and they want to talk about it, just connect. That would be really great. Second thing, I'd mentioned before, anyone who had any personal direct encounters with any of the living or deceased Beatles, or even people in their circle, if you had a run-in with Mal Evans back in the day or something like that, any personal direct stories of contact, interactions, stuff like that. I've already got one almost put together, but at least it's captured, so you'll be seeing that on the YouTube channel soon. But anybody else who's got any stories, it could be something that happened at a recent concert from Paul or Ringo, could be something that happened years ago, could be anything at all that was a direct interaction with a Beatle or someone in the inner circle. That'd be really cool if you want to share your story. Better still, if you've got any kind of visual accompaniment to it, that would be really cool as well. So another thing for anybody who's got that, just kind of reach out if you want to share it through the show. That would be great. And then last, the other thing I wanted to mention was I am planning an upcoming show, and I was wondering if there's anybody in the listening audience that deals with civil law professionally that may also, if you listen to the show, then clearly you're a big Beatle fan as well. Preferably a Brit, somebody who could speak to the workings of the British court system. But I'll take anybody at this point. If you are a Beatle fan in the realm of civil, not criminal law, it'd be great for you to get in touch, because there is a topic I want to explore, and I'd like to get somebody who actually has hands-on experience rather than somebody who's just read a lot of books. That'd be cool. So if you're hearing this and you're interested in allowing me to pick your brain, that would be great. Get in touch. Thank you. So about this show, if anybody here is not up to speed on all the shows, there was a recent one done, I think, in the last month and a half or so, The Brits Get Back, where I had producer John Leckie back on the show. And then new to the show, a couple of musicians who started playing professionally in the late 70s and in the 80s had some chart successes. Derek Forbes, bassist with Simple Minds, and Ian McNabb, frontman with the Icicle Works. It was a lot of fun doing that show, and it kind of opened the door to some other things. There was an offhand remark made by Ian during the taping of that conversation where he was referring to a book written by Dan Richter. Now, if anybody listening knows who Dan Richter is, I don't need to explain, but for everybody else, he's a guy that was described by Arthur C. Clarke as the world's most famous unknown actor, or something to that effect. His big claim to fame on the big screen comes in 2001, A Space Odyssey, where in the Dawn of Man sequence, he plays the lead ape. I think that might have been how he was credited, or at least that's how people come to know him. But Dan was, by that time, an experienced, trained mime who'd gotten around quite a bit in the world. And at the time of the filming of 2001, which was 1967, he also was, by that time, well acquainted with Yoko Ono, before John Lennon even was. He knew her going back to 1964 in Japan. And they stayed friends. And Dan, by the time John and Yoko connected on a romantic level, he was around. He was still in Yoko's circle. They were basically living together. They were in adjoining flats in London. And he got to see it all, then got drawn into the Beatles' inner circle. And for a time, through 1973, worked with John and Yoko as just one of their personal assistants and helped manage and run things, whether they're working on recording projects, film projects, or just running Tittenhurst Park. Dan was there. Now, I'm sure a lot of you listening to this have seen the 1988 Imagine documentary done by friend of the show, Andrew Salt. And there's that sequence with Kurt Claudio, the guy who showed up at the Tittenhurst Garden. He was described as a homeless veteran, although that's not wholly accurate, as we now know. Nonetheless, he was the one that had the encounter with John that you see. It's a pretty moving sequence that you see. And anyway, Dan is standing there in the shot, as it were. So he was around. He photographed John and Yoko a lot, including both covers for the Plastic Ono Band albums in 1970, as well as John's portrait for the label of the Imagine album. I believe he took himself too. I think you see the footage of that, in fact. But he was around. He was around for a lot of the sessions and certainly living there at Tittenhurst, doing a lot with them in New York. In any event, Ian had mentioned in passing a book that Dan had written called The Dream is Over, London in the 1960s, Heroin, and John and Yoko. And I hadn't read it to this point. I was aware of it, and I'd read things about it and reviews and stuff back when it came out, which was about 10 years ago. What kind of put me off it, not anything about what was in the book, because everything I saw was quite positive, but I saw that the foreword was written by Yoko, and I was thinking that, well, this is a sanctioned publication. It's going to be like a bunch of other ones we've read where you've got people that are sort of professional Lennonistas, and we know who they are, that basically toe the party line and show up for the sanctioned documentaries and things. So we know exactly what to expect, and therefore I was thinking, well, there's probably just one more of those, and so it's not something I need to prioritize at this point. And it was through Ian mentioning it and talking about it that I got curious to revisit it. And I couldn't get my hands on a hard copy quickly, but I did find it's readily available as an ebook. So I got that, read it, and it's like, geez, this was really a fascinating account of everything as described. London in the 60s, his own background, which was interesting as hell. Dan is way more than just a lead ape and a personal assistant. He was a poet and a dancer, came from a family of artists. His story itself is fascinating. And then you bring London in 1960s, heroin addiction, and the Beatles and John and Yoko into the mix, and it's a very compelling read. He does fill in quite a few gaps in our knowledge of things that happened during the period, say roughly from 68 through 73. It covers a ton of ground through the Beatles breakup, and he was basically a fly on the wall for an awful lot of stuff. And he's a super smart guy. I cannot recommend it highly enough, actually. Now, I guess if you're able to find a print copy of it, jump on it, because the publisher, as he noted, went out of business, and so it is a little bit scarce, but he is thinking about putting it out again himself, and that would be great, because it is a terrific read. I highly recommend it. But the other book that he'd written, and Ian, as you might have heard in the show that he appeared in, talked about being a sci-fi and space junkie back in the 60s when he was a kid, and he was really into Arthur C. Clarke. And so Dan, in this prominent role in the film 2001, working with Stanley Kubrick, wrote a memoir of that as well, called Moonwatcher's Memoir, a diary of 2001, A Space Odyssey, and the foreword is written by Arthur C. Clarke. So anybody out there that's really into 2001, you can't go wrong there. I've not read it, Ian has, and it's just like two of his worlds colliding between that and the Lennon book. But anyway, he mentions that on the show as an aside. It got me curious enough to revisit it, and I thought, God, this is a really good book. I should have Dan on the show. And it didn't take much persuading to get Ian to act as guest co-host for the show. You'll hear his enthusiasm from start to finish with the conversation. And as it happens, something else came up that Ian will be back on the show in the same role coming up, and something we'll be taping sooner probably rather than later. Another thing that was of great personal interest to him, and you'll hear why. It happens to be a guest that I've already had on the show before, but this was a topic we hadn't talked about before, so you have that to look forward to. Anyway, Dan Richter, super fascinating guy. I could have spent hours and hours talking to him, but as it happened, the day that we chose quite randomly to do the taping was his 83rd birthday. And so I thank him for availing himself on what ended up being quite a busy day for him, for making Ian's, one of his great bucket list things, and just for the great conversation. So We had a lot of fun with it, and like I said, check out the book if you have the opportunity. I believe that you'll enjoy the 2001 Moonwatcher's memoir as well, if you can track that down. But anyway, great guest. And don't forget the other things I mentioned. The Beatle personal encounters, a civil law lawyer in Britain, and Glastonbury. Here we go with the conversation with Dan Richter, co-hosted by Ian McNabb.
Such an honor to speak to you. I have so many questions to ask you, and I'm sure you've been asked them all before.
I'm always hoping that somebody will ask me a new question.
Okay.
And that might happen today. That might be a new experience for me.
Yes.
Is it okay to call you Dan, Mr. Richter?
I would prefer it.
Okay. I have many questions, won't keep you too long, but some of the things that I'd like to ask you, what was it like growing up in 1940s Connecticut?
Well, first of all, there was a war going on.
How did this relate?
You didn't feel it that much. I sensed the war through my parents listening to the radio. Does that make sense?
1 a.m. Eastern War Time this morning, BBC broadcast Allied High Command urgent instructions to people in Holland, advising them that if they are living within 35 kilometers, about 18 miles of the coast, to leave their homes immediately, and also to keep off roads, railroads, and bridges. These instructions from BBC followed in less than an hour after a German broadcast announcing that Allied parachute troops had landed in France. That report is not yet confirmed by any Allied sources. These bulletins came to you from the NBC newsroom in New York. We return you now to our regularly scheduled program.
And I would see the anxiety and concern in their faces. So I knew something was going on that wasn't very good, but it was hard to place it. We would read comic books with pictures of Japanese with glasses and buck teeth and, killing people and, that kind of stuff. And, pictures of Germans, like haughty,
Monocles.
That was it. But otherwise, it was delightful. It was like at one of the comfortable bedrooms of New York, we're right side of town, and it was all nice people, nice white people.
Your mom was a cartoonist, is that correct, Dan?
Yeah, my father was a cartoonist with the New Yorker magazine.
So, you must have had a pretty nice house and lived in a pretty nice place.
Yeah, he also had a panel with King Feature Syndicate that was a cartoon panel, the daily panel that was syndicated all around the world. So we had money. We had a beautiful house with grounds and a gardener and a couple of maids and a cook and 24 acres of woodland.
You had it made, man.
Yeah, I went to a private school and all my friends were named like Muffy and Coco, and, Trip,
Okay.
Just as a way of easing into the conversation and what brought us here, Dan, do you remember John Leckie?
The name sounds vaguely familiar.
He would have been an engineer at EMI during the Plastic Ono band sessions in 1970.
Yeah, I did not go to those sessions.
Well, he remembers you.
Well, maybe I did go to this.
Right.
But no, I don't think I went to the sessions. But we were also working on the albums at Tittenhurst. I did the covers of them, and I did the photographing, and I worked out the design. I came up with design elements that John and Yoko eventually approved. And then after I'd done all the paste up and everything, I turned it over to John Kosh, and John did the finish work on it. But we were also, I'm trying to remember, I don't think we had the studio going yet.
Right. You talk about that in the book. And so Plastic Ono Band, the two records were recorded at EMI. And Leckie was there as tape op. And in the course of the conversation of the last show we taped, he was describing the joints that Mel would roll versus the ones that you would roll on the console, and how there was a difference between the British ones and the American ones.
Well, I had good taste in dope.
Right.
And I've read your book, man.
Mel was the sweetest human being in the world. You always get a lot from him. You know what I mean? I was more restrained, and sophisticated. Like when we were going to do, John had told me in the morning, we're going to start recording the Imagine album tonight, and we didn't, and I thought, oh my God, I don't know if we're ready or not. We badly ran around, and he got people to come in, and I called up Mal and the other people and said, we got to get people down here. And so Mal showed up with a half a kilo of Afghani hash that was unbelievable. You know, it was like, no, it was half a kilo. It was like big, you know, this massive hunk, which was, I think, what everybody needed at that point.
You've done so many things with your life. You're a lover of the arts, music, poetry, which I'd like to come to in a minute. What was it about mime that attracted you, sir?
My father was a cartoonist and a painter. My mother was a painter. We were surrounded by artists, writers. And where I am now in Cape Cod, it's an artist colony where we would come up in the summer. My father started coming here in 1928 as a young painter. So I was always surrounded in the arts. I just assumed I'll go into the arts. And I studied ballet from a very early age. I loved ballet because it was all girls, you know, no boys. And I was little, you know, I started when I was like 6 years old or something.
You know, were the boys in your class, Dan?
No, it was always girls. Boys didn't do stuff like that. And they all took care of me and hugged me and took be nice to me. And so I always liked that. I studied ballet for off and on for many years. And when I finally went to acting school, the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, I took a mime class. It was actually the very first class I took was a mime class, you know, started out. And I had this dance background. I also had studied with a couple classes with Merce Cunningham. I knew dance, but I don't have the right body for a ballet dancer. You got to pick up girls and things like that. And I could just do mime. I was really good at it instantly. You know, I just had to think for it. Now I had to learn some of the physical disciplines, techniques and things like that, but you do that by just repetition. But I could do it, you see, and I could play characters and I could just make it happen.
It's like your natural thing.
It was a natural thing. And I remember my teacher was Paul Curtis, who taught the class, who was the founder and the director of the American Mime Theater. And I went up to him after, I said, I'm going to end up performing with you. I was cocky, you know, 19-year-old or something. And he said, oh, and 6 months later, I joined the Mime Theater. And I couldn't take my second year at the academy because they asked me to teach mime there. So I couldn't be a teacher and a student.
But it's in New York.
In New York, yeah. And I stayed with the Mime Theater for about 3 or 4 years. I was the lead performer and I was just good at it.
That was my next question, Dan. It's like, it seemed like you were doing it all there in New York. So why did you decide to move to London?
Because I was reading Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception.
Oh, man, yeah.
And
yeah.
you know what I mean? And Alan Watts, you know, the thing about Zen. And I spoke some marijuana and it was like, wow, you know, it's like new world, new life, you know, everything's new. And I was reading Allen Ginsberg and people like that. So I thought to myself, there must be more than just kissing rich foundation people's ass so you can get enough money to, you know, and spend 8 hours in the studio every day. And, you know, even the most successful mimes like Marcel Marceau don't make that much money. Maybe Bill Irwin, people who did crossover who went into other things. So I had to explore and find out what this new thing that everybody was talking about and doing was. So I took a year's leave of absence. And the American National Theater Academy gave me papers to introduce me to theater because ostensibly I set out to study mimetic forms in different theaters around the world, which Berliner Ensemble, you know, the Comédie Française, the École de Jacques Lecoq. And I just went and I was going to go to Japan for the No and the Kabuki and India for Saraswati and all of this stuff. So I set out, but the point was I started getting high and I started meeting all these people.
London in the swinging 60s.
Well, yeah, you see what happened is that for some reason, when I was in Delhi, this Princess Sina Reshevsky had gotten a houseboat up in Kashmir. The Maharaja had got her for the winter. And she was going to give up the world, become a Tibetan nun, but she wanted to have one last year before she became the nun and just wanted to see holy people and things like that. So she had asked Alan if he knew any poets who were in India at the time. And somehow I got on a short list and I met Zina. I went up to her place with a couple other poets. And we spent the winter there, and I fell madly in love with her, but I was completely out of her league. She wanted racing car drivers. She dated Marlon Brando, things like, you know what I mean? Klutzy kid, you know. She stole Marlene Dietrich's girlfriend from her in Paris, you know. I mean, this woman was amazing. So anyway, after I'd finished my year traveling around, that's where, by the way, where I met Yoko, was in Tokyo at that time. So I came back to the States, and I was really, at that point, I was into doing dope and whatnot, and I was hip and hanging out with all these people and on the scene. And I thought, why am I in the States? I'm just going to get busted here, you know? So I went back to Athens, because that's where Xena was for her last year before she gave up the world, and rented a big house. And then all these people started arriving from Morocco and things like all over. And Leonard Cohen was there and all these beat people. And I published a poetry review. I was painting and writing poets. I published a poetry review, and it was in English, so we took it up to England, you see, up to London, because that's where things were happening. And Barry Miles was working at that point, Better Books, was doing poetry readings, and he was distributing the poetry stuff for us, and I got involved in the readings, and I got to know Alan and all these people, and I got swept away. And I stayed in England for 8 years.
And what a time to be there, Dan. You know, I mean, really, it was exploding, man, wasn't it? I mean,
yeah. Well, I give an example is that Alan turned up from Czechoslovakia, where I know they had busted him because the students turned him into the king of the Bay and all like that. He was running around naked, and you know, and the government people say, you can't do that kind of shit here. We're a Soviet socialist republic. So they kicked him out, and he came to London, and I was hanging out with a writer called Alexander Clarke and this fellow R.D. Lang, who was doing all this research. And Alan came and said, well, I'm going to be on television tomorrow. So we had the idea, we'll go find a venue, and Alan could say, everybody should come to this, you see. And our poetry readings were like 80 people at the back of bookshops and things.
Well, you ended up doing that big one at the Royal Albert Hall, didn't you, Dan?
Yeah. So Jill and I, my wife Jill and I, went around looking for a venue. And we were sitting across from the Albert Hall in Hyde Park there and smoking a joint, and looked across the hall, and I looked at it and I thought, whoa, that would be perfect, you see. So we went over, and Jill said, don't be daft. You can't rent the Albert Hall. You never know.
Get over yourself.
You know. So we went over there. They said, well, we've just had a cancellation 5 days from now or whatever it was. And it'll be like 800 pounds, which is, you know, or maybe with even more, maybe 1,200 or something like that. And Jill just happened to have this check her parents had given her. I don't know, because we were getting married, I think, something like that.
Wow.
We took the check and signed it over to the Albert Hall, and we got the booking.
You only had to pay that much to hire it.
Well, it was probably more, but in other words, I think we had to put 500 down or something like that to come up with more money. So we went back and told Alan, and he went on the television and said, well, gathering of the tribes, they're like the Holy Communion. And so the next day I went back to the box office because I figured I wanted to work out payment. And they said, you don't need to give us any money. You're almost sold out, Wow. And that's when we realized something was going. It wasn't just this little group of beat and people. This thing had been spreading. There were thousands of people, and we didn't even know about it. So we turned away a couple thousand people. They were outside. They had piles of police there trying to control the crowds. So that's what happened.
To backtrack a little bit, you talk about this in the book, and it sounds pretty amazing. And it seems like when you landed in London, you landed with exactly the right axis of counterculture. There you go. With Barry Miles, John Dunbar, the Indica, what became the Indica. It makes me wonder, was Paul McCartney present for this event?
People say the Beatles were there. I don't think they were. I never saw them, and I probably would have known because I was sort of coordinating everything, and we would have known. So I don't remember it, but my memory, I'm 83 years old.
Well, if you remember the 60s, you weren't there.
Yeah, exactly. And I had seen the Beatles at a couple parties and things like that. And I guess I met Paul a few months later at John Dunbar and Marianne Faithfull's house. Marianne had just had a baby, and she invited Jill and I over. She was going to cook, you see, and make a dinner. And so John and Marianne and I and Jill were there, and Mary had made a duck with little peas and things like that. And the nanny had put the baby to bed. We were all there. There was a knock on the door, and it was Paul, and he had just come back from the States, and he had said, I got this grass from Bob Dylan and doesn't know how to roll a joint. And we said, don't worry, we know how to roll joints.
And then this guy called Stanley Kubrick, he's having a little trouble. He wants to do this Dawn of Man scene, and he's trying all kinds of shit to try and make it look real, and it looks phony. And he doesn't want a monster movie. He doesn't want a guy in a gorilla suit. So how did he find out about you, Dan?
Johnny Easom, who had helped with the producing of the Albert Hall reading, was a New Zealand poet and producer. And Johnny was hanging out with a fellow named Mike Wilson, who had gotten advance from Columbia Pictures to do a Satyajit Roy film. And Arthur Clarke was in love with Mike Wilson and had funded him doing some Senegalese language films in Sri Lanka.
Of course. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so Arthur and Stanley were talking, and they said, we have to talk to a mime. Where's the mime? And Arthur told Mike that, and Mike told Johnny, and Johnny says, I know the best mime in town. It's Dan Richter. So I got invited out so that Stanley could pick my brain. And I was not looking for this, but I was super beat and hip. And, I wasn't looking at Hollywood, but I knew about Stanley Kubrick, So I was very cocky, and I basically said, it's an acting problem. It's not a movement problem. Movement comes later. You first have to get the audience by the balls, and you have to, you have to make something happen immediately. And I don't need to tell you that. You're the greatest director in the world, probably. Yeah, he said, yeah, but how do you do that? And I said, I'll show you, and give me 20 minutes. If you have a black leotard lying around, that, and a couple towels and an empty stage, and I'll show you. And I put the towels in and changed my shape around and, sort of played this, this character. And I went out and, like this. And I like it. Well, that's great. Yeah. And I made my point that it was an acting thing, and that we could figure the movement out. That might take quite a bit of time. It's a technical problem, but it's a solvable problem. And so he and I were in sync immediately.
Did you like him, Dan?
Yeah, I love Stanley.
Real Bronx dude, wasn't he?
Yeah, he's so sweet, and he had a great sense of humor. He was incredibly intelligent. He was so far ahead of you all the time. He was way out there. Well, he was a chess player too, He was way out here. He'd say something that seemed innocuous and sort of, why is he even saying that? And then you'd realize 2 hours later why he said it, because he set in motion some things that would result in this result.
Oh, my word.
Wow.
And he didn't suffer fools easily, quite often people would just disappear. He would never fire anybody or raise his voice, but somebody ask somebody, get rid of that guy, will you? He's wasting our time.
In this wonderful book, ladies and gentlemen, which are actually quite difficult to find now.
They went bankrupt, those people.
Well, I'm sure it wasn't because of this.
No, the book sells, it's not major bestseller or anything, but it constantly goes. And I'm probably going to do a reprint of it. I haven't got to that yet. I'm as big in your 80s as you don't care about things. I don't mean that in a negative way, but it's just like, okay, another book, this, it's like I'm concerned with my children and my grandchildren. And have I had my swim today? And did I do a little rock climbing? And can I teach a class? And things where I can be sort of.
It was my great pleasure a few years ago to meet Keir DeLay and Gary Lockwood.
Yeah.
And it was such a great honor to meet them. But the first thing that came out of my mouth, I have these things planned. I'm going to be cool. I'm going to say, the right things. The first time I met Neil Young, I said to him, when are you getting back together with Crosby, Stills and Nash? I'm like, no. So anyway, when I went up to Keir and Gary, I went, listen, are you guys really fucking sick of talking about this movie? And Gary goes, oh, man. Well, Keir goes, well, funnily enough, somebody asked me that question the other day, and he was absolutely so professional. And
yeah, well, Keir's like that. Keir's great. And
he was like a rock and roll star, isn't he?
Yeah, and I get to see him because a couple times a year we do events together or something, where you sign autographs or talk before a film and things like that. And he has a house in Connecticut, so he's fairly nearby.
You had met, as you started to say before, Yoko in Japan. And so you guys stayed in touch and were pals, and suddenly she's in London the same time you're in London, and then you're more or less sharing a residence at Hanover Gate. You want to talk about that a bit?
When I left India on my way to Japan in the spring of '64, I didn't have any money. And so I had taken a tramp steamer, a French tramp steamer that stopped in every port between Bombay and basically had bunks down, dormitories under thing for Chinese workers. And I was on this thing and I ran into this conceptual artist, Jed Curtis, who had done some conceptual performances with Yoko. And he said, well, you and Yoko are going to hit it off. You've got to meet her. I'll introduce you when we get to Tokyo. And Jed was going to spend a year there. I guess he had a job teaching English, and that gave him a chance to be in Japan for a while. And so when we got there, he introduced Yoko and I, and we used to see each other almost every day for the month or 6 weeks I was there. And she helped me. I was doing some street performances to raise money so I could eat. And I was studying the No Theater. I would go there to watch rehearsals during the day and then the performances at night. And I would talk to the performers and, why do you do this? And how do you do this? And I was very serious about that. Was what I was really into. And we became good friends. And then when we ran into each other in London, we ended up getting an apartment together. So we lived there until John, she and John fell in love, and then her marriage broke up and whatnot. And she and John moved out. And then what had happened was, as a result of all my experimenting with drugs, I had become addicted to heroin. So what I thought was just an exercise in understanding why these black saxophone musicians can play such brilliant things. They played brilliant things because they were brilliant, I wasn't the dope, but I found out, and I was registered with the Home Office, so I was legal. I was getting it on the National Health and everything, but I was a sick puppy. I mean, it was terrible, and I just couldn't get off it. And the point was, when John and Yoko first bought Tittenhurst, we had just come back from the States. We'd gone over to try to do a sort of geographical cure, and it didn't work. So we came back to London so I wouldn't get arrested. And Yoko was really being treated very poorly by everybody at the Beatles office for whatever reasons.
It was like she was seen as the invader.
She really was. And you see, what I don't think any of them realized, she had a big career as a conceptual artist in the avant-garde art world. She had status and was a leader. She had patrons like Peggy Guggenheim and whatnot. And Marcel Duchamp came to her performances. And she was a serious artist. But such an avant-garde area that, well, the people did know her through film number 4, which had created quite a stir. But the people around Apple, they didn't know anything about artists.
It's that thing that John said about he's brought this strange Oriental lady into this Anglo-Saxon, Northern English world.
And very male-dominated.
It's still very misogynistic in the 60s. Obviously, you know more about this than I, but feminism was still a long way away.
Yeah, and the Beatles' wives or girlfriends were supposed to know their place and not interfere with what the boys were doing. They were still referring to the Beatles as the boys. And they still do today. We're still posting things on Facebook, about how much they hate Yoko and things like that, what an interloper she was. But the truth of the matter is John and Yoko fell in love.
Yeah.
And John was just bowled over by her ideas and her approach to the creative life. And that's what he wanted. And Yoko is a very strong person, and he wanted that.
You're putting your finger on something right now that I think in Beatle world, you've described the Yoko haters that are out there, and then there's the faction of fandom that appreciates her and buys into the whole John and Yoko love story and all that stuff, to varying degrees of truth there may be to what they put out. But with the way she came into Beatle world, as you guys are describing, there might have been some residual World War II racism there as well. It might have been more the persona and her being at the opposite end of the artistic spectrum, where you've got, on one hand, the most accessible, popular artist on the face of the earth. And as big a rock star as she is in her world, it's a niche.
Yeah.
And when you have this persona that doesn't sort of meet halfway, if he'd fallen in love with Petula Clarke, I don't think anybody would have had a problem.
Nobody would have cared.
Right.
But they also, there was financial reasons too, because they thought because of their relationship, they were ruining the Beatles. And the Beatles was this machine that produces a waterfall of endless money. And just on very basic levels, this is a financial thing that was going on from their perspective. I would get phone calls from the office. Can you tell John that if he and Yoko keep talking about this, can you get them to stop? Can you do that? It's like they never got it. And Yoko, I mean, when you talk about money, she ended up managing all the money for him because she comes from, her father was a banker, her mother was an aristocrat, they lived on Park Avenue. She understood money. She also understood power, and she knows how the world works. And she took John that next level up. I don't think he ever would have gone to that next level without her.
Yeah. So when I saw your book, when it first was published, I think 10 years ago, and I saw that Yoko had done the foreword, I'm thinking it's going to be another in a line of books that keeps the myth going that other people in their world, whether we're certain photographers or their PR flack, other people like that, put this narrative out there. And they're trying to keep him on his pedestal and sort of pave the way for when Yoko does pass on, that she's still cemented into that aspect of the Beatles' legacy. Then I read your book, and it's like, wow, there's some really unflattering stuff in here. So I was sort of surprised that what you wrote was still okay with Yoko to go ahead and write the foreword for you, assuming she read it.
Well, Yoko believes in the truth.
Yeah, well, she definitely believes in her version of the truth. But what you put in there, you're speaking to it right now about John's psychological need, apparently, to have somebody kind of dominate him and lead him.
Well, he had Mimi when he was young.
Bingo.
Very strong. She was very strong. Like Mrs. Smith, she was a wonderful person and loved him very much. And she provided, because he well, you don't need, everybody knows about his things, but he felt like those parents are lost. They're gone. You can't, it's like he's a little child who's floating around. And Mimi was an anchor and Yoko was an anchor. Yoko would say, we can't do that. That's not a good idea. We should do this. We should do that. And you can't criticize, they had a real relationship. And she was very dominant and remains dominant, even after his death. And he wanted that, and he was okay with that. And in many ways, they would, on their own, plan, they're going to have a press conference or they're going to be interviewed by somebody. They would figure out what the pitch was. Basically, they knew what they were going to be asked. They saw every time they knew they were interviewed, they saw that as a window where they could talk to a couple million people. And so they knew what they wanted to say. And John really got a lot from Yoko, but they worked things out together and he would push Yoko forward. Did it on purpose. It wasn't her invading. It was him bringing her up and pushing her forward. He wanted to do that. And he was very comfortable with that. And I think he felt it was liberating for him in many ways.
What did you and John talk about in the wardrobe?
I don't remember. Well, we were probably...
Please, Guru, enlighten us.
Well, we were probably joking. I mean, my relationship with John is that we used to kid around a lot. He had this great sense of humor and a sense of fun. And we would talk about everything under the sun, I mean, I don't remember specifically. And something, John and Stanley was very interesting for me because I've had a chance to be close to super geniuses, super creative geniuses. These are two, and they're very different. You look at them, they're very different, but they're very the same in certain ways. One, an intelligent sense of humor, being able to see all sides of things, and also an interest in everything. And that you can talk about, doesn't matter what you talk about, you can talk about anything and it'll be a great conversation. And you might learn something, they may learn something. So I don't remember the specifics. I don't remember what happened this morning.
I just thought that thing that you mentioned that in your book, because I remember reading that somebody asked John, what did he think of 2001: A Space Odyssey? And he went, oh man, I go and see it like every day,
Yeah.
And then for Yoko to introduce your good self into his life.
It's funny. I'm pretty shy. I know famous people, the last thing they want to do is people meet them, because the people always go, well, what happened? You know, what this, like that. And so I wasn't trying to meet John. Sort of, we'll see what happens.
Were you a Beatles fan?
I appreciated their music.
Oh, no.
No, I appreciated their beautiful music, and I enjoyed it and dug it. But I was more into classical jazz and like Dylan. I like Dylan. I knew rock and roll.
But you weren't a super fan of the genre. You kind of appreciate it and was aware of it.
Yeah, and it was, how could you not be a fan?
Yeah.
In 60s London, where you turn the radio on and here's a new song by Cream,
Sure.
And, which blows your fucking mind away. But what you have to remember, for us, when it was happening, each song, each thing was new.
Right.
It's not part of the background like it is now.
Well, now it's all a fucking retread, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. And it's like when the Sgt. Pepper album came out, you didn't have to be a fan of the Beatles. This was amazing what was going on. I mean, look, when John and Paul knew they had to write 3-minute long songs with a hook, and that was their job, and that's what they had been doing for years, and they were the best at it. And then they started making longer, like Hey Jude is how long is that? It's like
7 minutes.
Yeah. And the Sgt. Pepper band, running tapes backwards, and with George Martin bringing in classical musicians, let's put a string quartet behind Yesterday.
I think, like, Dan, with you talking about your love of Dylan there, a love which I'm sure Robert and I share. It's like, for instance, when something like Blonde on Blonde came out, 66, double record, and, the last side was one track.
Yeah.
And like all of a sudden something's happening, and then that definitely influenced the Beatles. And like with Sgt. Pepper, it was the first time you got a gatefold sleeve with all the lyrics on and inserts, and the album ran to exactly the running time allowable on vinyl. They were pushing the envelope.
Oh, absolutely. And for me, Dylan, you have to remember, Dylan came from where I came from, sort of the intellectual, folky, liberally East Coast, listening to folk music, and isn't this is so interesting? You know what I mean?
We're putting a rock and roll beat to it.
Yeah, that was okay. Well, Bob did. Well, that's okay. If Bob wants to do it, that's great. I told my children, I did a last wishes thing, and I created a folder in Dropbox and shared it with my children. So to what to do when I kick the bucket, And I told them I didn't want any tears, and if they did do a memorial, I wouldn't mind if they played Bob Dylan singing Mr. Tambourine Man.
Oh,
nice.
man.
Wouldn't mind that at all.
You take that over the Byrds version?
The Byrds were a beautiful version, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, all those high harmonies.
Yeah.
But anyway, no, I wasn't a Beatles fan, but I knew and was into their music.
The longest answer to any question I've ever asked. But it was beautiful. Robert, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to ask, coming from your experiences to this point, now that you're living with Yoko, Hanover Gate, and then drifting toward Beatle world when John and her, he starts out as a patron, then they become a couple. Were you aware of when they first started using heroin? And what observations did you have to make about that? Because you already had experienced that.
Yoko had mentioned it. Actually, she had mentioned it. And I think she asked me once for something. I gave her a little bit, because I knew how dangerous it was for them to try to get it. And I was very concerned because I had been struggling with heroin addiction. And the last thing I wanted was any friend to get involved in it. But I did know that probably around the time they started. The thing is that there was drugs everywhere in London in those days. And John used to go to clubs and parties and things like that. And there was all kinds of drugs around. So I'm sure he was exposed to it fairly early on. But I don't know exactly when they started or how they started. I know it wasn't through me.
Right. There's different accounts. James Taylor has now just offered himself up as introducing it to the Beatles.
He gets a bit of publicity out of that.
Well, exactly. So I take that with a grain of salt. But the research we know, I think it came from Peter Brown, who was, of course, an insider, said that Yoko introduced it to John, that she had tried it while he was in Rishikesh when she was in Paris. And he didn't like the idea of her experiencing something that he didn't share. Then they started taking it together to celebrate themselves as artists, which is kind of a peculiar way to get into becoming a junkie, I guess.
I'm trying to think. When she was in Paris, I guess she saw Ornette Coleman at that time. Is that the time she saw Ornette?
Right. You speak of that in the book, the February 29th concert.
Yeah, but I know that she had been in Paris, but she may have been in Paris another time. Peter's probably a pretty good source. He doesn't make things up, and he wouldn't say something he didn't think was well sourced.
If he's available, we'll absolutely hook up.
I think he's in New York. I think he's still alive. I haven't been in touch with him for years.
Oh, okay.
I have a question here, which I think is quite interesting. I hope you'd agree. Like I say, you speak about heroin with admirable frankness in your books. Do you regret it being in your life, or do you think it enabled things to happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise, even though it was a nightmare to get out of?
It's a difficult question. I mean, that's like, why is the sky blue? The heroin certainly truncated my career and really fucked me up. I think I could have been much more successful at so many things. I know that after 2001, it was very hard for me to get work because people knew I was an addict.
But Mr. Kubrick certainly didn't badmouth you, did he?
Oh, no.
He knew you were using.
And in fact, Stanley was very interested in and was very concerned, was hoping that I was able to get it straightened out. I was a functioning addict, which is the worst kind, because when you get stuff from the pharmacy and it's legal and you've got a doctor you're working with and things like that, once you become addicted, you're basically taking heroin to not get sick.
So you're not getting a high, you're just staying straight normal.
You're not being sick, because you get sick if you don't have it. So you take enough heroin to not get sick, and then maybe smoke a joint to get high. Most addicts, because of the illegality thing, are constantly chasing after it and never know what dose they're getting. Most addicts don't build up big habits. When you're getting it legally, you're taking very large amounts of it, and you're not feeling very much. You get very sick. If you can die if you don't have it.
But ultimately, of course, you got off it. And was there a day that came when you went, because presumably it was a long journey, and then one day you went, do you know what? I feel normal again?
Yeah, I think so. The problem is that I stopped taking heroin, but I didn't stop being an addict. At that point, I just smoked more grass, and I started using more cocaine and, whatnot. And I still was in the process of escaping from reality pretty much. And I was just relieved to not be a junkie anymore. I mean, it was just, God, because the cost to me was terrible. I probably never would have hung out with John and Yoko and did all that stuff I did with them had I not been on heroin, because I would have been so busy working, because after 2001, there was a lot of things I could have done. I would have probably had a pretty good film career.
Can we talk a little bit about how the hell did you get into mountaineering? Obviously, your body is very supple and all this, but
I've always been in mountaineering.
To go from all of that to mountaineering is incredible.
What happened is when I was about 8 or 9, I would go to camp in New Hampshire, which is up in the mountains here in the East Coast. Yeah. And we would climb mountains in the camp. And I loved it. I was good at it. From an early age, my grandfather, and when I say an early age, I'm talking 2 or 3, my grandfather would take me in the woods and taught me how to figure out where I am, stay found, never get lost, build a fire when it's raining. So I had all this lore.
Okay.
But that sort of went away once I started, acting and doing things, and I went off. But when I stopped, when I got sober 36 years ago, I owed a lot of money. I owed probably $500,000, or so. Most of it was a bad dope deal where a guy got murdered, and I had to get straight. My daughter was born, and I looked at her and I said, okay, I can't do it for myself, but I'm going to do it for this baby.
Absolutely.
And that's it. And I just stopped. That was it. It's just suddenly all the rehabs that had failed, everything that had failed, for that moment, it stopped. And I was sick for a bit. I felt lousy for a couple of years probably after that. And I started this business to pay off everything, and I designing systems and software for production companies and taking advantage of the new PC, which is just coming off. And then it just took out, and I got bought out by entertainment partners in Hollywood, and they bought me out and made me a Hollywood executive, which I did for 20 years. So here I am now in Hollywood, and I bought a house right by the mountains in Sierra Madre above Pasadena, and I looked up at the mountains and I said, that's a mountain. And I grabbed one of my sons and we went and climbed the mountain. And from that day forward, I was hooked again. And now I still teach rock climbing, and I just taught a navigation class. And I just love it. I was out this morning we did a couple miles in the dunes here along the seashore with my oldest son, Sasha. And then I went swimming, went out, did a quick quarter mile before talking to you guys. And I like being active, using my body. I always have. And mountaineering there was this plainclothes nun who I ran into about 25 years ago. And she said, you should stop mountaineering. Because at that point, I was doing very dangerous stuff, ice climbing and all this rope stuff, full on, And I said, what are you talking about? She said, you've substituted this danger of mountaineering for heroin. You should stop it. I said, I'm not going to stop it. You should wear
a habit
on and things like stop walking around masquerading in a suit. I didn't get it.
What is the question that you wish somebody had asked you that nobody's asked you yet?
Well, there's a question nobody's ever asked me.
If your book publisher decided they were going to print an expanded version of The Dream Is Over, were there more stories that didn't make it into the book that you would be happy to include?
That's an interesting question, because usually my writing, I always cut about 30% out. So there's a flow. Usually a book should be interesting. And Yoko also at the point is people that have consciousness spans are so short these days, you should never make anything too long.
That's for the general readership, but I can assure you, Beatle people into this history, you can't get enough.
I'll tell you what I left out. I left out all the things that I don't want to tell about my friends.
And that's fine. We can respect that.
That's really what it comes down to. I tried to be as honest as possible, and because I'm very aware of the future, and people looking back, and I want to make sure that I tell the truth, because when we're all dead, I think John and Yoko are pretty important people. Will turn out historically, I think they would be pretty important, and I want to make sure that at least anything that I write about is accurate and truthful.
And that's what I want the listeners to know, is that despite what you might be inclined to think, like I was when I saw Yoko's name on the front cover, there is a resonating honesty to this book, and not everything you have to say is very flattering. And you do fill in a lot of gaps, especially the section about the concert for Bangladesh and what led up to that and how it all kind of fell apart as far as the Lennon's involvement goes.
Yeah, that was an interesting point in John and Yoko's relationship, because it reached a point and it turned at that point. They had to decide. There's a couple times it's interesting how strong their relationship is. There's a couple times in their relationship where they had to decide whether they wanted to be together or not anymore.
I couldn't believe that Yoko was considering doing the show without John. And I wonder how George would have felt about that.
He made it clear what he felt.
Well, that's what Alan and I were trying to get through to her, is that you don't understand, Yoko. They don't want you on that stage. And it's that simple.
You made her understand that eventually, obviously.
Oh, yeah. Alan and I sat with her in his office for 2 or 3 hours that afternoon, basically saying, what we have to do now is you and I get on a plane and go back to England. That's what we have to do now. There's nothing else to be done at this point. Right now, the world doesn't know you and John had a fight and he left for France. And in a couple hours, they will.
Dan, you deserve a lot of credit for that. That you and Alan kept that together, because that would have been disastrous.
Yeah. Well, John had a terrible temper, and Yoko had it's like a bullheaded single-mindedness sometimes, which are strengths. Oh, well, temper, I don't think temperance is strength, but his passion was a strength. And he almost killed somebody at Paul's 21st birthday. He'd get drunk and, he tried to avoid drinking, because when he got drunk, he was a bad drunk. and he could be a nasty drunk. You know, this is so strange. He was the sweetest guy and so thoughtful and caring about people. Like when Claudio, the kid who was standing outside the gate, and we decided to bring him in so he could look at John's eyes. What does John do? He says, "When was the last time you ate?"
That was so beautiful.
Yeah, let's come in. He saw it wasn't dangerous and came in and fed him, and had breakfast with us all at the big table.
But it was so beautiful the way that young man was going, but these lyrics you've written, okay, they're about you, but they're about me, they're about everyone. I'm not writing about you, but it's beautiful, that scene.
So John was it was like a Jekyll and Hyde thing, where if he drank too much, he could get nasty and violent and things like that. And he was very aware of it, and he was working hard to deal with it. And a lot of it probably goes back to the terrible experiences of his childhood. I mean, having parents reject you, and
everybody that he loved seemed to die. Stuart Sutcliffe.
Mm-hmm. His Uncle George.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, the Bangladesh thing is sort of the worst side of Yoko, this single-minded thing where she's like that. And I was unhappy that she did Season of Glass or whatever, where she showed John's glasses with the blood on it. And also had something out of her sitting in the park crying, with the Dakota in the background. I was uncomfortable with that. I saw an interesting thing that Sean wrote the other day. We're talking about that and how Yoko uses all of her experiences. Well, actually, there's a New Yorker article that came out on her, which is brilliant, where it's really starting to look at where her place is vis-a-vis the art world and everything else. This woman has a place there. Now, just because somebody's a great artist or a genius or something, it doesn't mean they have to be nice all the time. I mean, look at Picasso. What a motherfucker that guy was.
Well, don't say judge the art, not the artist.
Yeah, or Wagner. I mean, I didn't listen to Wagner for years because he was so anti-Semitic. And then after I was in the middle of chemo and I suddenly was listening to, on the radio, the overture to the Meister Singer came up, and I started crying uncontrollably. And I thought, fuck Wagner, I'm going to listen to his music. Screw him, That's always a problem with artists. We judge them by their politics, their bad politics, or the fact that they beat their wife, or Lucian Freud, who had 40 children by every woman in London,
Phil Spector.
Or Phil. Well, Phil was nutty as a fruitcake, man. He was I'm amazed he stayed out of jail as long as he did. He had this guy, George, who was a retired cop or agent or something like that, black suit, like that. It just followed him around, just trying to keep him out of trouble.
Waving guns around in the studio.
Yeah. But when he was okay, he was great. Certainly a genius when it came to producing. I mean, just saw it, let's double up the drums, let's do this, and some people have the gifts, that doesn't mean they're a particularly nice person or not nutty as fruitcakes.
Right. He's another one that had a crazy background. I don't know if you guys knew that his parents were first cousins who married, and his father committed suicide when he was quite young. And that's where To Know Him Is to Love Him came from.
To know him is to love him. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. The damage that's done in childhood sometimes completely determines how the adult will be. Because I can remember, I do have memories when I was very little of what it is to be afraid of something. I don't get fear like that anymore. Guys come up with a gun, I'm going to be afraid, but I'm not going to be afraid like that. I'm not going to have those deep, big feelings which children have, I'll lose my parents, what happens if daddy never came home, And, well, John, daddy, they practically flipped a coin as to who would keep him, and daddy went off, and then mom gave him away to Mimi. I mean, how do you live with that?
Dan, I have one last question for you. I'm sure you've been asked it a million times, and I probably know the answer, but this is probably the only time I'm going to get to meet you. So I'd just like to ask you this one. Moonwatcher's enlightenment scene where he throws the bone skyward is one of the most significant moments in cinematic history. Whenever I watch it, it never fails to give me goosebumps and move me in so many ways. When was the last time you saw it, and does it have the same effect on you?
Well, I couldn't watch it for about 20 years because I kept seeing all the things I did wrong and how I could have made it better. Why the seam on the costume, nobody ever noticed. I noticed.
Like Spielberg only sees a rubber shark, doesn't he?
Yeah, and I think it was at a screening about 20 years ago at the Academy in Beverly Hills, and Tom Hanks got up and said, somebody asked him a question, said, what part would you have liked to play that you've never played? You know, he said, I want to do what Dan Richter did, to play that. That's some of the best acting I've ever seen. And I was like, you know, and people were cheering and things like that. And I started, you know, I got weepy and what.
Oh, great.
And at that point, I realized it was pretty good, that scene. And I started seeing it again like that. And I saw it about 2 years ago at the Museum of the Moving Image. Keir and I were there. They did a Kubrick show. And there was a new print that I didn't like very much that some director had done. Can't remember anybody anymore. But I watch it now and I think it's really great. And I know why it's great. I know what Stanley did and I know what I did. And I feel very privileged to be able to know why something works.
Just that scene, that the whole Dawn of Man scene. And I believe that, was it Arthur Clarke who said that they didn't get the Academy Award that year, but Planet of the Apes got it because they thought that the apes were actually real.
Could have got that fucking award, man. Those bastards, they were stealing stuff from us. Who else would it be? They were developing their costumes at the same time. A mask got stolen. But the thing is that scene, Stanley once said that all I need is 5 or 6 really great moments in a film, and then I can put the rest together. And he knew that all the time. So he was always looking for that opportunity, that chance thing that he could develop into something.
Yes.
And the fact that I was, you know, and I was playing it very slow, because I knew it was called it Cinerama. It wasn't real Cinerama, but it was a gigantic screen, 2.2 to 1 aspect ratio and whatnot. And he's got an 85 millimeter portrait lens on it. I'm going to look massive, you know.
Yeah.
And so the last thing I want to do is this. So I was just, you know, moving the head just like that and things like that. And so I was just sort of playing around with the bow and see little movements, and one went in the air. And I saw it as, oh, I fucked up. And Stanley said, no. He saw things. And we then spent the next 2 months working on getting bones to go there. It wasn't like he just went out and then shot it. We played with it and we did research into high-speed cameras. So maybe it's like we matched the fastest speed they could get for the 70 millimeter thing going through. And then I would do slow motion myself so that we could get it slow enough. You know, a lot of work went into that. But it was that little moment that he realized, the genius in Stanley, there's a potential in that, and built it out. Because everything else he did completely. You know, people say, why did he take so many takes? Not because we did it wrong the first time. It's because he learned something. He kept learning things from each take.
Yeah.
So, okay, oh, wow, can you do that again? But this time, you just turn a little to the left when you do it so that I could see more of your face. Yeah, I could do that, Stanley. You know, so we do it again. That worked perfectly. But if you were, seems to me, if you were a little higher, your back was a little straighter, that might even be more. Okay, we'll do that. Meanwhile, somebody was running. Wait a minute. I like the way he ran across. Let's do it again. So it was a creative process. There's multiple takes. It wasn't doing it over and over until you get it right. And Stanley always knew that he was going to learn something every time the camera turned. Every time he did a take, there was a chance for him to learn more and how to make it better.
Amazing.
Wow, thank you, Dan. What an amazing, amazing story. And bearing in mind, to let the viewers know that you're in this goddamn monkey suit on a super heated stage for months and fucking months.
Over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was very dusty and dirty, you know, because it was like the desert set. So the dust would come up and get in our eyes. And I was wearing lenses to make my eyes brown because I have blue eyes. So whenever there was a medium shot or close up, I had to wear these fucking things.
Oh my word.
Yeah, it was terrible. And the kids had struck, and then we got new things, and we had to have nurses and things there, and compressed air pumped into our costumes to cool us down.
You must have lost a lot of weight.
Yeah, you would have to eat a lot to keep it on, I'll tell you that much. It was terrible. It went on for a long time, looking at all the call sheets, and I think it's like 6 to 8 weeks.
Such an honor, Dan. Such an honor. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'm glad that I got to tell the story.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dan.
Moonwatcher's Memoir by Dan Richter, forward by Arthur C. Clarke. And The Dream is Over, London in the 60s, Heroin, and John and Yoko. Fantastic book. Check them out, readers. Hopefully the hard copies will be back in print, but at least there's the ebook you can get right now. Dan, I am honored, as Ian said, to have you on the show. Great listening to you, and what a fantastic book.
Thank you very much.
One of the pleasures of my life to talk to you online, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song by The Corgis.